Today's pericope, we're going to be exploring Ephesians chapter 6, 1 through 9. And it's just like the last time I taught. It's very direct, very succinct, and very compact. And so we'll be going over this, of course, but there's a lot to this. This pericope provides guidance for our relationships and responsibilities within our families and within our workplace. And as you know, I've been going through these slides and practicing and reading them. And one of the things that really kind of pops up for me is we're going to see Paul's perspective on how we should be raising our kids, how we should be treating our loved ones and our family, our partners, and how we should be in the workplace, how we should be treating our workers if we're employers, and how we should be working as employees. And this is all beautiful, and you'll see this is really wisdom here. But one of the things that really challenges me is, how do we do this? Like, this is all great, Paul. These are all great things, and we should be these people, and we should be doing these things. But with the pressures that are on us, the pressures that are on young families today and old families today, there's a lot of pressures. There's a lot of things that can go wrong and can really pull our attention away from what we should be doing. And all through today's worship service, I was wondering, these are great ideals. These are great things that we should be striving for, but how do we do it? How do we do it in the face of the pressures that we run into in living life? And Pastor Na said something that was really, I wrote it down because my memory is just horrible. Let prayer replace worry. And it's very simple, it's very direct, but in thinking about that between when he said it and now, I'm thinking that is the way that we can accomplish this, is by prayer, is by beginning our days in prayer. And I'm not going to shut up. I'm going to start teaching, but I'm going to get off of this and move on.
Bobby McFerrin said it very well. Don't worry, be happy.
Don't worry, be happy. Don't worry, pray. When faced with a very difficult situation in my life that set me back and really challenged my faith, it was starting every morning in prayer that got me through it. And it was just that simple. Every morning I sat down and I had a conversation with the Lord every morning because I needed help big time. And you hear me pray and thanking God for the challenges because it drove me closer to the Lord. And so when you hear all the things that I'm about to say today in our exploration of Ephesians, think about, well, how do we do this? And I think the answer is what Pastor Na told us today, is to replace worry with prayer. And let's get started. These are some of the words you're going to be hearing today. And I think this is a wonderful thing to keep in mind: unity, integrity, love, the gospel, harmony, obedience. All these words are beautiful, beautiful words that Paul is going to bring out in this Ephesians message in chapter 6, verses 1 through 9. So keep those in mind. Keep these words in mind also. I know that Jay has talked about this many, many times in our classes over the years. The 10 commandments are broken down, so to speak, into the commandments that describe our response to God and our relationship with God. And then their other commandments are our response to others, how we should be living in the world and relating to others. And so I don't want to quiz you on the 10 commandments. I just want to say that the first 4: do not worship any other gods, do not make any idols, do not misuse the name of God, and keep the Sabbath day. That is our responsibility, and that is what we are to relate to God. They describe our relationship with God and the things that we should do to stay in right relationship with God. But there are 6 other commandments. Maybe I counted wrong, but possibly
You
not.
don't have it on the screen, Russ.
No, I don't. I just have my notes here. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not lie, and do not covet. They are the commands that we are to live by with respect to how we behave with one another. So these are fundamental commands which should form the basis of our lives and the way that we behave towards God and others. So Paul focuses, this is a little bit of a review. In Ephesians, what we've been learning so far in our study of Ephesians, Paul centers on fostering unity, love, and mutual respect with various spheres of life, guided by Christ's example and the principles of the gospel. So as we know and we've been studying, Paul wanted us to have unity in the church. Now, we know that Israel, once set aside as God's chosen, are now united with all who follow Jesus Christ. And we've been talking about the difficulties that those Jewish believers probably had accepting Gentiles into church. I mean, we've talked about how difficult that must have been for them. But Paul is telling us that all believers, whether Jew or Gentile, are called to live in harmony, recognizing their shared identity in Christ. And in Ephesians 31 and 32, Paul encouraged us to build one another up through love, humility, and forgiveness. Paul speaks of family relationships in chapter 5, verses 21 through 33. Husbands and wives are to model their relationship on Christ and the church, emphasizing again love, sacrifice, and mutual submission. And in today's pericope, chapter 6, verses 1 through Paul, parents and children are guided by principles of obedience, honor, discipline, and nurturing in the Lord. Paul goes on to describe our workplace relationships in Ephesians 6, 5 through 9. And Paul encourages mutual respect and integrity between servants and masters, or today I'm probably going to say employees and employers, reminding them of their accountability to Christ. So throughout Ephesians, as we've been studying, Paul highlights the importance of Christ-centered relationships where love, humility, and service create harmony and reflect God's purpose. So now, focusing on today's scripture, when we read Ephesians 6, 1 through 9, Paul is providing guidance for relationships and responsibilities, as I mentioned earlier, within families and workplaces. If I lose my voice, I'm sorry, I'm still recovering. And just in verses 1 through 4, we'll read the children are instructed to obey their parents and act out on honoring them, which aligns with God's commandments. Fathers, or today I'll probably say parents instead of just fathers, as parents, we're encouraged not to provoke our children to anger, but to raise them with discipline and instruction rooted in the Lord. Tough, as we've all probably had children, we've all probably are raising children. We're probably still raising our adult children to some extent, and now a lot of us have grandchildren. This is really, really important for us to keep these things that Paul is telling us in mind. Servants and masters, employers and employees are advised to obey their earthly employers with sincerity and respect, working as if we're serving Christ, not just people. And employers are reminded to treat their employees fairly and without threats, recognizing that both employees and employers share the same heavenly master who shows no favoritism. So briefly, this passage that we're studying today emphasizes mutual respect, integrity, and accountability under God's authority in all of our relationships. So can I have someone read the next 2 slides? This is actually Ephesians chapter 6, verses 1 through 9.
Sure. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise, so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him.
Thank you, Roger. So, an important question here. Do you think that Christianity has been responsible for certain cultural shifts since the time of Christ? That's kind of a rhetorical question. Because what I want to help you understand now is the difference between the social norms back in Jesus's time and the social norms that are prevalent today. And so let's start with women. And women generally had a subordinate status to men and were often viewed as property or dependents of their fathers and husbands. Their primary roles revolved around the household, bearing children, managing the home, and supporting their husbands. Public leadership roles were rare for women.
Russ, I think we might qualify this as to, what's prevalent today in Western culture, because some of those old norms are still prevalent
You're right,
in other
Roger.
cultures.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but you're absolutely right. Yes, Pastor Knopf.
A footnote to Roger's comment. When I prepare couples for weddings, I remind them to prepare more for marriage than the wedding, but most church weddings anyway still start with the father of the bride bringing the bride down the middle of the nave there.
To give her away, right?
That's right. In fact, the language still lingers. Who gives this woman away in marriage? And although culturally we have shifted more toward the egalitarian mindset, the habits are still there. It's just like language, we say, oh, I feel in my gut. Well, we don't believe in that part of the body as the center of our being. So it is a financial transaction between one man and another. That's what a marriage was in the ancient world, and still in some parts of the world. And so two men agree to buy and purchase something. That's why we still have. My wife is, she's a pastor, she's pretty much in our world's standards ethically in tune, but she still wanted to have her father go away and believe that with our children, that the bride side has to do the rehearsal dinner. And all this stuff. So there's
the
still
bride side pays for the wedding, the groom side.
the wedding. That's right.
pays
That's it.
Sorry, you got the big bill. You got
Tell
me about
it. Well, the thing is, we still have benign expectations that go right back to the ancient world, including the wedding cake and the bridesmaids. These are all from that world where women were property and men were thought to be of a certain kind, and that's why the men are warned that you need to love the Bible is plenty of that too. So Roger's right that not all the world has been North America or Europe, but even Europe and North America, we're still, 2,000 years of development for sure, but we have habits and ways of thought and speech that still are biblical or ancient, and perhaps a long road still ahead of us, because the Bible speaks of transformation of the entire being, human soul there. Transformation of the mind. We're still not there.
No,
I'm trying my parts, but
yeah, we are still not there. Women are still not there.
we're all there. But we have to keep trying. We've come a long way since then, though.
We have.
As Roger understands that. Not always.
No, that's right. Not always. Legal wise, women had limited legal rights. Women were often excluded from formal religious education. And in many cultures, women could be dismissed. And I'm not sure whether that means killed or divorced or what that means, but they could be disposed of for trivial reasons. and their voice in public and religious affairs was extraordinarily minimal. Now, the status of children, particularly when they were young, really young, were often seen as less significant until they could contribute to the family economically. Education, well, with wealthier families, boys were educated while girls learned the household duties. In poorer families, survival often dictated roles early on. Male children were valued more than female children, and infanticide, especially of female infants, was a common practice in parts of the Greco-Roman world. Fathers had significant authority over children, even to the extent of deciding life or death in Roman households. And the Latin name for this this head of the household being a male with absolutely total authority over his family is called patria potestas, and I'm butchering that, I'm sure. But let me just give you a very, very brief idea of what that is all about. That meant that in especially Roman households, the male had complete authority over everything. And that could mean the life and death of the child. That could mean selling family members into slavery. They had absolute authority and control over the family. But I found this interesting, that although this practice initially granted the head of the household almost unchecked power, its scope diminished over time as Roman law evolved. So we evolve, our governments evolve. And in Rome, it evolved to the point where reforms restricted its most extreme aspects of this parental, this father, this patria potestas, which I can't pronounce very well.
Well, roughly translated, it's father power.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Absolute father power. But
that's severe. That's very severe, because that includes life and death of a child. I mean, even though, I was brought up kind of like with the father had the last word, first and the last word, but never thought of anything like destroying your child. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Maybe guiding them to the right way. And his word was...
Thanks, Tony. The point I wanted to make here is that the Roman government recognized that this was not a good thing and emphasized the protection of family members' rights and welfare. So the Roman government stepped in and eventually said, this is not good for our society. We've got to change this. We've got to protect the members of the family from, fathers who are overbearing and have the right to make these decisions for the family. Oops, not what I wanted to do. Slaves even had it worse. Slavery was widespread institution. Slaves were property and had no personal rights, though their treatment varied widely depending on the master's character and the slave's role. And as you can imagine, slaves performed many tasks. Some slaves could be granted freedom, but that was not the norm. And slaves could be punished in any way that the master deemed acceptable. There was little recourse for poor punishment of slaves. Now, so that was the way governments existed. That's the way societies existed. That's the way societies and social norms have been evolving. But Jesus had a different approach. And so in contrast to social norms that we've just kind of briefly gone over, Jesus often demonstrated that he included women in his ministry, and he taught them alongside of men and affirmed their worth. With regards to children, Jesus elevated the value of children, welcoming them and using them as an example of faith. And with regard to slaves, while Jesus didn't really directly challenge the institution of slavery, His teachings on love, equality, and the value of every person laid the groundwork for challenging oppressive systems.
I want to chime in on slavery a little bit.
Mhm.
Because I think it's important to note that slavery in Roman times, as bad as it was not like slavery in the United States prior to the Civil War. For one thing, it wasn't based on race. Anybody could become a slave. A father could literally sell his children to become slaves, or one group would conquer another group and the prisoners would become slaves. Okay, but there wasn't the notion, as there was in the United States, that there was this class of inferior beings who kind of deserved to be slaves, if you understand what I mean, and did not have the intellectual capacity or the physical, well, I wouldn't say physical, but at least,
Subhuman.
yeah, that was not the case with slaves in Roman times. And in most cases, there was a price that would be paid for a slave, and the slave could buy himself back.
Mhm.
The slave could have property, could earn money, and some slaves were, more like what we would think of as servants as opposed to slaves. For example, Luke himself, we believe, the author of the book of Luke and the Acts, we believe was a slave. Okay, although he was a physician, but he was still, as a physician, he was someone's, we believe, slave. So, it's really important when you look at the scripture and you see that Jesus didn't step in and abolish slavery, that we weren't talking about the kind of slavery that we typically think of in the U.S.
And interestingly, in that period in the U.S., there were indentured servants. Indentured servitude was part of the fabric of society then. But apparently some genius or geniuses decided that, we can go to Africa and get these dark-skinned people and treat them as subhumans, and then we don't have to, pay a price for an indentured servant.
Yeah. And, I mean, I don't want to apologize for that, but they didn't have the knowledge we do about what genetic differences there are, for example, which is basically none.
Good points. Yeah.
Just melanin, basically.
Pastor Knapp? Yeah.
Again, a footnote, what Jay said is certainly significant to remember. To go along with that, there were slaves in the Roman world who were better educated and better at, in fact, all kinds of skills than their masters or their children. So these masters certainly had the same power, pater potestas, over them, but they would treat them very, very well so that they could educate their kids because they couldn't. So one of the most well-known examples is Epictetus. Many Greeks were enslaved by Romans because they were conquered, as Jay mentioned. But they're much more well-read and knew more about politics or history or physics or mathematics. And so these are the slaves that would be teaching as tutors. Now, they were still property. Father of the family had power over them. But so it's a very complicated, multi-faceted term in the ancient world. And the other thing is, a lot more slavery than we could imagine in our 21st century. We do still have slavery. I hope you knew that in our world. It's not that we got rid of slavery. It takes different forms where money and property are still the currency for thinking about people, human beings. And not necessarily racially, but in terms of classes. In India, there's a caste system you probably know already. They're the untouchables, and so that's something that the rest of the world looks at and says, wait a minute, that doesn't seem like it's possible in the 21st century, but surely. Indentured servitude, slavery is still very much a real thing. But as Jay said, we have to understand the biblical context in order to understand how radically and subversive and challenging these were for the church that had slaves in the churches, we find, right, as well as masters worshiping together. Can you imagine that in the South? Slaves and white masters and African slaves worshiping in the same and reading the same text to say, oh, I'm supposed to love you, you're supposed to love me. As Christ loved the church.
Well,
Yeah.
just
Radical.
one of the clever sayings that I've heard is back in the antebellum United States. In the North, the feeling was that the blacks could get too high as long as they don't get too close.
Yes.
But in the South, the blacks could get as close as they want as long as they don't get too
That's a
high.
very good point as well.
Yes, I grew up in South Louisiana, deep south as you could get. And my dad used to always say, the difference is in the South, we hate blacks in general, but we love the ones we know.
Mm.
And in the North, they love blacks in general, but they hate the ones they know.
Oh my God.
Right.
With that.
Yeah.
And there are in our modern world, there
Yeah.
still are cultures where literal slavery still exists.
Jay's point is very important, to have an entire kind of people,
Yeah.
almost all the continent of Africa, except the northern part, which was part of the Mediterranean world. But a blanket to say this, anyone who looks like this or comes from these lands, they're automatically not human, not to be counted as human. That's in the ancient world. If you asked a Roman citizen who owned slaves, they wouldn't think of them that way. In fact, they used them for all kinds of trades and, in fact, martial fighting arts as well as education. It was not. In fact, Romans knew Greeks were superior in knowledge. Well, they owned them as slaves.
Okay, well, we'll come back to this topic very shortly here. But first, let's talk about verses 1 through 3, where Paul addresses children and emphasizes their responsibility to obey and honor their parents as part of the Christian faith. So the verse reads, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." So Paul connects obedience to parents with obedience to God, implying that honoring parents is a reflection of a child's faith. And it is not blind obedience, but one grounded in Christian values and morality. And Paul describes this behavior as inherently correct or right, indicating that this behavior aligns with God's natural and moral order for family relationships. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment, with a promise. So honor goes beyond mere obedience and includes showing respect, love, and care for parents, recognizing their role and sacrifices. Now, the commandment with a promise, Paul references the fifth commandment, as we saw, pointing out that it is unique in including a promise of a blessing. And that promise is so that it may go well with you and that you may enjoy long life on earth. So the promise connecting to honoring parents suggests that God rewards this behavior with a life marked by well-being, peace, and stability. Now, contextually, while a long life on earth might imply a literal long life, it can also mean a life of fulfillment and alignment with God's purposes. So just to summarize these first 3 verses, Paul calls children to honor and obey their parents, framing this as both a moral duty and an act of faith. He emphasizes that this command is rooted in God's law and comes with a promise of blessing, underscoring its importance in Christian life. I'm thinking back over my experience raising my children. I wasn't always understanding. I wasn't always a good disciplinarian. But I think that we all need to reflect on, how we treat others and especially our children. I'd like to say more, but I don't think I can. What are some of the pressures? Before I talked about the pressures that impact families. And so those pressures can impact the way we treat our families. And I lost my train of thought, but I kind of got it back. I was in graduate school when I was raising my kids. I had a full-time job. I was in graduate school, and the care and the love that my children got sometimes depended on how much homework I had, how much my boss was driving me crazy, how much I was worried about daycare for my kids. All these outside pressures impacted the way I behaved. And I'm just wondering, can you think of some pressures that families are under that may impact the way that we as parents behave towards one another and our children?
Finance.
Absolutely. Health.
Peer pressure for the kids.
Yeah. There are a lot of things that we've had.
Childcare.
Yeah. Childcare, health, illness, loss of work, unexpected events that happen in our lives. These are all pressures that impact us. And so I was asking, how do we move on? How do we continue? How do we live our lives close to Christ when we're experiencing these types of real pressures? And as I mentioned earlier, I think Pastor Na hit it on the head. Replace worry with prayer. Other thoughts?
Well, I think it's important to be introspective and to think about what you're doing, which is, it's too easy to fall into patterns. And I can give a couple of examples. In my own case, one thing that happened to us as our kids were becoming teenagers, our oldest daughter started to become conscious of style, and what the kids were wearing and what kind of sneakers and what kind of jeans and so forth the kids wanted. And at first our reaction to that was, a pair of sneakers is not worth that much money, we're not going to pay it. Or a pair of jeans is not worth that much money, we're not going to pay it. And I think this was starting to frustrate her. It says don't exasperate your children. And I think that we were exasperating her by constantly refusing. And it wasn't in our case, it wasn't even that we couldn't afford it. It was that we didn't think it was worth it.
Yeah.
Okay. So what we decided to do instead was to give her a clothing budget. And she was entitled to use that however she wanted to. So we gave her this clothing budget, and she decided at first she'd rather have designer stuff and less of it. But ultimately she started shopping in thrift stores. So I think actually having her own budget to use for that purpose was educational for her.
She got to keep the change, I assume.
Well,
if she didn't
I
spend the whole budget.
I honestly don't remember how we administered it, but it did resolve that problem. I had a cousin who was the daughter of my Baptist preacher uncle. And that family had two children, and then suddenly had a third child that was much younger.
Oh, yeah. I can relate.
And meanwhile, mom and dad were busy. Dad was Baptist minister, and mom was extremely involved in the work of the church, women's groups and all kinds of things that were the work of the church. So they thought this was their mission, and they thought this was important. But what they did to their daughter was they stuck her with care of this baby. And she became very resentful. And finally sort of broke ties with them, left home, went to college on her own, got married, moved to Pittsburgh, and really never repaired that relationship. And it was brought on, I think, by her being exasperated by the imposition they were making on her to care for her little brother, who she no longer gets along with either.
A different form of slavery.
So those are both examples of parents exasperating their children in ways that the parents might not be able to see for themselves. And in order to know you're doing that, you would have to examine yourself pretty carefully.
I think some parents today do that by encouraging or insisting that their children participate in sporting activities. You're swimming.
Or insisting that they get jobs.
Well, too. Yeah, but that would exasperate them because, I really don't like swimming, or I really don't like soccer, or I'm really not good at it. So why are you making me do it? So parents can do it that way too.
Mm-hmm.
And the parent wants your child to be involved, meet friends and be involved and not all the time. being alone.
That's the tricky part of it,
Yeah.
okay? This wanting to, at least in the context of a church group like ours, okay, you can have the best of intentions and still exasperate your children. You can think you're doing the right thing and still exasperate your children.
Well, what
Yeah.
about in the scouting? I mean, do you have some scouts that resent being scouts, but their parents insist
That's
on it?
possible. I can't always tell what's
I was
going
one
on.
of them,
Okay.
The one on what? I missed it.
one of the scouts who really didn't want to be a scout.
Oh, okay. Mhm. Well,
I know I have parents that pressure their kids to become Eagle Scouts and hold out rewards like you can't get your driver's license until you become an Eagle Scout.
Oh, wow.
But I'm not sure that doesn't pay off. Because sometimes kids do need some sort of encouragement. Getting that service project done is a big job. I've never met anyone that's an Eagle Scout who says they wish they hadn't done that.
I know several parents who did their child's Eagle Scout project.
Oh, no.
So we can help a little bit too much in times. It's tricky. It's tricky. And frankly, the only way we can get to this is through prayer. And I think it sounds lame, but I really mean that. The only way we can get a handle on this, the only way we can get insight into ourselves, insight into what we're, as Jay was saying, we have to be self-aware and try to understand and discern how we're treating our children and be willing to change. But we can only get that insight through our relationship with God. And I think that's also part of Paul's message in Ephesians. Like, we can't do this without the Lord. Can't do any of this without the Lord. Okay, let's come back to reading my slides here. So in 6:4, Paul provides guidance specifically to parents, emphasizing their responsibility in raising children in a godly manner. Fathers or parents, do not exasperate your children, as we just talked about, and bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Raising children and maintaining healthy and God-centered familial relationships is challenging because of the pressures that are impacting families. And like Jay was saying, so how do you treat your child when they come to you and they want something that you're not really prepared to give them? You have to think about it. And Jay and Betty certainly thought of a way to encourage their child and to help them to get what they were really seeking, and help it teach them and help them to develop, going to thrift shops and getting what his daughter needed.
One of the real challenges is when trying to bring your children up in the training and instruction of the Lord exasperates your children.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
You have to try different ways.
Yeah. And once we are done raising, well, we're never done raising our children, perhaps, but once our children become adults, the job's not done. You still have influence over them.
Well, then they get to try to train us.
Well, the way I look at it is they get mature and they finally start listening to us in a different way. I'm experiencing that now with my kids. My kids are listening to me in a little bit different way. Instead of just dismissing me offhand, they engage me and ask me questions and are, trying to get some support.
And sometimes they have things to say to us that get us to change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I remember the words of the senior George H.W. Bush. He said, we must have done something right raising the kids because they keep coming back.
That's nice. That's a nice thing. Bring them up, nurture with care, training, instruction of the Lord. I think I'm going to move beyond this. But just to summarize, to balance authority with compassion, avoiding actions that harm our children emotionally or spiritually, and instead we're to nurture our children, children's growth through discipline, guidance, and biblical teaching, fostering a faith-centered upbringing. In Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 8, Paul addresses slaves, employees, and employers, and providing principles that reflect Christian values. Although written with the context of first century institution of slavery, the teachings also apply to broader principles of work and authority relationships today. So obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Who has ever worked for a boss they didn't like?
Who hasn't?
This is difficult to do. I know in my career, I've had all kinds of bosses, and it has sometimes been very, very difficult to work with the right attitude, or to work with the attitude that Paul is asking us to work with. Paul calls for obedience that is genuine and respectful, not grudging and superficial. And slaves or workers are encouraged to view their service as an act of worship, aligning their earthly duties with their devotion to Christ. And in difficult situations that I've experienced, doing this has actually helped. I know I've had several horrible run-ins with bosses, with coworkers, and just praying about it seems to help me to get through it and to survive the workplace. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ doing the will of God from your heart. So integrity and service, Paul advises against working only when being watched or to gain approval. Instead, slaves should work with integrity, recognizing that they ultimately serve God. And the work that we perform, even in a challenging position, should be done as a reflection of our commitment to God's will. And then serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people. Heartfelt service, Paul encourages serving with enthusiasm and dedication, reframing work as a spiritual act of service to God rather than merely fulfilling human obligations. Because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whatever they are, whether they are slave or free. So Paul reminds slaves that God sees their faithfulness and will reward their good deeds regardless of their social status. And equality before God, this teaching highlights the impartiality of God, affirming the worth and dignity of every individual, whether slave or free. So just a summary on this portion of Scripture, Paul encourages slaves to serve their masters with respect, integrity, and wholeheartedness, as if serving Christ directly. He reframes earthly labor as part of God's will and emphasizes that ultimate accountability and reward come from the Lord, who values every person equally. This teaching upholds a Christ-centered ethic in all areas of life, emphasizing eternal perspective and divine justice. Now, finally, in Ephesians 6:9, Paul shifts his focus to our employers. So employers, or those in authority, instructing them on how to treat their workers in a Christ-like manner. So treat your workers in the same way, mutual respect, Masters are called to exercise the same principles of respect, integrity, and sincerity that Paul urged of slaves, just as slaves serve their masters as if serving Christ. So masters or employers are to lead and care for their slaves, their workers, with the same mindset. I had a service technician into the house on Thursday to fix we have a steam oven, and they had to replace the steam generator. And I got to talking to the men, and I asked them, how did you get into this business? And they told me how they did it. And the one guy said, I used to work for a company, and they micromanaged everything I did to the point where they knew when I would leave a job and go to the next client, they wouldn't pay me for the commute. And he said, it was on my job, my time, my car, and they refused to pay me for the commute. And plus, they micromanaged every aspect of my job and took the fun out of work. And he said, I wish they would have realized that if they just let me do my job, I would have been more productive. I would have earned them much more money, and I would have been happier at the end of the day. But no, they thought that their bottom line, that their profit, they had to micromanage me so that they could maximize their profit. And a bunch of us just quit because we just weren't being cared for. And I thought, geez, oh, Pete, I wish more employers realized that the more autonomy and the more they cared for their employees, the better their return on investment would be. And my wife told me about a study that was done many, many years ago. It's in the book that she writes, Better Business, where she said that this is actually a proven point, that employers who take the time to value their employees and take the time to serve their employees do much better financially. It's just a topic that's close to my heart. So do not threaten them. Avoid abuse of power. Paul explicitly warns against using fear, intimidation, or violence to control employees. Leadership should be exercised with kindness and justice, not coercion or cruelty. Compassionate authority underscores the responsibility of our employers to treat those under their care humanely and with respect, recognizing their shared humanity. Since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven. So there's a shared accountability to God that Paul is telling us about. Paul reminds masters that they too are under God's authority and will be judged by him. So earthly status does not exempt them from divine accountability. The ultimate authority, this highlights that God is the true master over everyone, and his standards of justice and fairness apply universally. And there is no favoritism with him. So God's impartiality, Paul emphasizes that God does not show favoritism based on social, economic, or hierarchical status. All people are equal before him, and masters are not superior to slaves in God's eyes. And fairness, this should inspire us. It should inspire humility in masters and remind them to act justly and mercifully. So in summary, Paul calls masters to treat their slaves. Paul calls employers to treat their employees with respect, fairness, and compassion, avoiding threats and abuse. He emphasizes that both masters and slaves serve the same heavenly master who judges all people impartially. This teaching reflects the transformative nature of Christian relationships where authority is exercised in a spirit of humility, justice, and love, acknowledging the equal worth of all individuals before God. And so here are the words again that we probably heard a lot in this study of this 9 verses in chapter 6. And I think they're words that we need to keep in mind, and that we need to do it like a comparison. Am I treating my employees? Am I treating my family and my partner? Am I treating my children in a way that brings harmony? Am I forgiving? I think these are words that you can use to compare. This is the way I'd like to be behaving. How am I behaving? It's kind of like an accounting process. How am I doing? How am I doing with respect to what God expects?
God doesn't play favorites, but he does favor those who obey and honor him. So he treats us all equally, but he's an equal opportunity God.
Yes.
We all have an equal opportunity to serve him.
I like that, Roger. An equal opportunity, God.